Good morning, everybody. Today's scripture reading is from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 22, and it's on page 192 of your Pew Bibles. It's verses 1 through 4. It says, "If you see your brother's ox or sheep straying, do not ignore it, but be sure to take it back to him. If the brother does not live near you, or if you do not know who he is, take it home with you and keep it until he comes looking for it. Then give it back to him. Do the same if you find your brother's donkey or his cloak or anything he loses. If you see your brother's donkey or his ox fallen on the road, do not ignore it. Help him get it to its feet."
So I read an article a year or two ago, and the article was making the argument that a lifelong commitment to a person in marriage is totally impractical. Basically, the argument was this: said, well, in previous eras of human history, maybe this made sense. Like in eras where usually only lived to like 40 or 50. Okay, well then that kind of makes sense, right? Because you get married, you have kids, then the kids move out. You only got a couple of years left anyways. I mean, well, what are you going to do? So you might as well stay together, right? But now that we are living into our 80s and our 90s, now this doesn't make any sense anymore. Right now, 60 is the new 20. Right? 60 is the new 20. Right? Listen, 60 is the new 20. All of a sudden, it's just like when you were 20, you don't have any kids in the house, no responsibilities, right? Except for here's the difference. It's 60 is the new 20, but with money, right? When you were 20, you were broke. Now you're 60, you have a retirement, money. I mean, what better time to sow your wild oats than when you turned 60? Thank you, Michelle. I could just end the sermon there, and that's it. That's why, okay. Today we are continuing in our series called 10 in 3. The 10 Commandments in the third millennium. And as what we're seeing here is that really this is a series on the book of Deuteronomy, because the book of Deuteronomy helps us to better understand the 10 Commandments. That actually many scholars see that the book of Deuteronomy is structured after the 10 Commandments. So you have the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy chapter 5, and then chapters 6 through at least 26 or so in Deuteronomy follow the structure of the 10 Commandments. So chapters 6 through 11 correspond to the first commandment. Chapter 12 corresponds to the second, so on and so forth. And so then when we come to this passage that was just read, this short passage is part of a section, chapters 20 through 23, which then correspond with the seventh commandment. And the seventh commandment is this: thou shalt not commit adultery. And so what we're going to see here is that actually this entire section it can be and ought to be applied in relation to marriage. We discover actually, if you look a little bit further on in this passage, in chapter 22, beginning in verse 13, it actually talks about sexual immorality. So we see that that's sort of that is what's in the mind of Moses as he is delivering this message. But if we take then the verses that were just read, that my wife just read for us, and we read them in light of what comes after in verses 13 and following, and particularly in light of the seventh commandment, I would suggest that a simple and central principle emerges. And here's what it is. You and your spouse belong together. You and your spouse belong together. Now, perhaps you're here, maybe you're single, and you're like, okay, well, thanks, I'll just grab some coffee and be on my way out. Let me tell you something, a couple things. First of all, you may not remain single for the rest of your life. Marriage may be in your future, so this may be important for you in the future. But secondly, as we will see, this points to something bigger than marriage. There is a bigger and more overarching principle which will emerge from this that applies to us no matter what our marital state may be. But for our purposes here, we're going to focus on this particular point. You and your spouse belong together. What we discover is that chapters 22 and 23 in the book of Deuteronomy, roughly speaking, are all about what belongs together and what does not belong together. This comes through very straightforwardly in verses 9 through 11 in chapter 22. Here it's highlighting things that don't belong together. It says this, "You shall not sow your vineyard with two kinds of seed, lest the whole yield be forfeited, the crop that you have sown and the yield of the vineyard. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. You shall not wear cloth of wool and linen mixed together." Right? It's talking about things that don't belong together. Now, here's the truth. When we look at the different examples that are given here and we ask why do these not belong together, scholars are not really sure. There are theories for sure about why this is being articulated as things that don't belong together. An ox and a donkey pulling a plow, maybe they are unequally yoked, right? So maybe they can't pull at the same speed, something like that. But with some of these, it's we really just don't know. Ultimately, however, what we need to see is that many of these commands, as part of the Levitical law, the law that's in the book of Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, is part of what is sometimes referred to as the ceremonial law. And what this is getting at is that there are these laws that were in place that were largely symbolic. In other words, they pointed to something deeper, a deeper spiritual reality. This is true for sure when we look at the laws of cleanliness. So they had a lot of laws about cleanliness, about hand washings, and how you might be in an unclean state if you had participated in some activity. If you'd been around a dead body or something like this, then you were ceremonially unclean for a period of time. And really, in the end, what this was designed to do was to serve as almost like an object lesson, a symbol pointing to a deeper spiritual reality. So all of this sort of ceremonial uncleanliness was meant to remind them of spiritual uncleanliness. And then cleanliness, getting yourself clean ceremonially, was a way of reminding you to constantly be focusing on your spiritual and moral purity. So it was like an object lesson. In this sense, it's not all that dissimilar to how a wedding ring functions. Right? A wedding ring doesn't, in and of itself, do anything. But what it means, what it symbolizes, is it's a reminder of the union between a husband and his wife. And it's a reminder to him and her as they see it on their finger. And it's a reminder to the community that these two belong to one another, right? And so in the same sense, the ceremonial law could function in that capacity. Now, what's interesting is in this section, we can actually go from the mere symbolic to the much more practical, right? In other words, you get this whole scenario of somebody's ox or donkey, sheep or donkey, that goes a-wandering, right? So somebody loses their donkey and it's wandering about, and Moses is like saying, well, look, if you come across somebody's donkey, take it back. It's their donkey, right? They belong together. The donkey belongs with the person who owns the donkey, right? Okay, so we get that, this idea of belonging. But again, if we read this in the context of marriage, in light of the seventh commandment and whatnot, then I think we can just put together this kind of simple point. Ready for this? As a donkey and its owner belong together, so you and your spouse belong together. Okay, I don't know how well that's going to resonate with you. Maybe you don't own a donkey. I don't know. So we could probably update some of the imagery here, right? We're taking this teaching from the second millennium BC. Let's bring it into our own millennium. That's kind of the point of this series. So we can upgrade. How about this? Okay, ready for this? You and your spouse belong together like cookies and milk. Cookies and milk, bagels and cream cheese, Texas and barbecue, pickles and a pregnant woman, crabs and Old Bay. Right? Yeah, this is for my wife. Like crabs and Old Bay is a Maryland thing. Right? You belong together. Listen, when you go down into the kitchen to make yourself some lunch, and you pull out some bread, and then you pull out some peanut butter, and you spread that peanut butter on the bread, and then you get out some jelly, and you spread that jelly onto the other piece of bread, and then you put it together, and it's just so wonderful, peanut butter and jelly. That should be a reminder to you of how you and your spouse belong together. You belong together like peanut butter and jelly belong together. In the book of Genesis, chapter 1, we get the story of creation. What's interesting is that it's a very poetic description of the story of creation. And the way in which the story is told, one of the literary devices that is used is a device known as a merism. And a merism is when you take two complementary parts and you bring them together, and then together they represent the whole. And so you find these binaries, these two complementary parts, kind of littered throughout the text. For example, you get evening and morning, land and sea, sun and moon. You find these sort of parallels throughout Genesis, and they are meant to complement one another and to be representative of the whole. So you get these binaries, and then do you know what the final merism is in the Genesis text? It's male and female. They come together. They are complementary parts which come together, and then they represent the unity of the cosmos. Okay? So let's kind of put it this way. You also might think of it this way. Just like morning and evening belong together, they come together to make a day. Just like the land and the sea come together to make the world. Wait, you and your spouse belong together. There's this almost sense in which it represents this cosmic unity, right? You don't just belong together like peanut butter and jelly and milk and cookies. You belong together like evening and morning, like the sun and the moon, right? This is why in the Bible, adultery is seen as so problematic, because it's not just the undoing of a relationship, it's that it symbolizes the undoing of the cosmic order. You belong together like the sun and the moon, like morning and evening. You know, I think married couples, we often have, at least when a married couple is in a healthy state. This doesn't happen sometimes when they're not in a healthy place. But when couples are in a healthy place, we have little pet names for each other, right? You know what I mean? So like maybe you call each other honey or sweetie or schmoopy. That might just be me and my wife. Maybe I shouldn't have shared that. Anyway, we all have these sort of pet names for each other. I want to suggest a couple pet names for you. How about instead of calling each other sweetie or honey, how about this? How about morning and evening? Good morning, evening. Well, good evening, morning. Good morning, sunshine. Good morning, moonlight. Right? Remind yourself that your union, your marriage is representative of this cosmic whole. But it's more than just that. You don't just belong together like the land and the sea and the sun and the moon. It's representative not just of this cosmic harmony, but also of the harmony, the divine human harmony of the gospel. That God desires for him to be united with humanity, and that marriage is designed to symbolize that union between God and humanity. And of course, this emerges in a famous passage from the book of Ephesians, a letter written to the church in Ephesus. Let me read this for you. A little bit of a long passage, but it's worth hearing. Here we go. Ephesians chapter 5, beginning in verse 22. It says, "Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with the water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and cares for it, just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church." Now, some of you here, us 21st century Americans, you may have heard the first verse and just tuned out, not heard the rest of it. The first verse says, wives, submit to your husbands. Ooh. We don't like that, do we? Wives, submit to your husbands. There it is. There we see the archaic nature of the scriptures. There we see the Bible throwing us back to some ancient patriarchal ways. Long live the patriarchy. Long live the dominion of men over women. Women need to stay in their place. It says it right there in the book of Ephesians, right? Actually, it's the very opposite if you just listen to a few verses later. Because here's what it says. It says, yes, it says, wives, submit to your husbands. It says, husbands, you are the head of the family, head of your wife. You are the leader in the house. But then what does it say? What does it say? How are you to lead? It says you are to lead like Christ led the church. And how does Christ lead? He gives his life for the church. You see, Christ turns this entire notion of leadership completely on its head. To be the leader is not to be the one telling everybody what to do. It's to serve. It's servant leadership. It's to elevate your spouse above yourself, to put her needs above your own. It's sacrificial love is at the heart of the kind of leadership that is being commanded here in Ephesians. You see, this completely puts an end to this whole idea of power and domination and all of this kind of stuff. In fact, I would even say what it does here, this whole notion of servant leadership in marriage, it takes the relationship far beyond just gender roles. And here's what I mean by this. So guys, here's the thing. Some of your wives, they feel loved when you bring home the bacon. Some of you, though, your wives feel loved when you cook the bacon. And some of you, your wives feel loved when you clean up after she eats the bacon. You see this? It just depends on the woman. I was talking to Dan just the other day. He was at home doing laundry. Michelle was at work. Right? I mean, their roles have changed in their life, in their marriage. You see, it's not about gender roles. It's about love, sacrificial love for one another. And see, here's the amazing thing about this. Christ's example, right, shows us how we are to love in our marriage, but we need to see that it also works the other way. It's not just that we see Christ and that becomes a model for how we operate within our marriage, but get this. The unity of our marriages serves as a symbol of the unity of God and humanity through the gospel. It's a symbol pointing, showing the world. It's a symbol showing the world a little microcosm of what God ultimately will do with humanity, his love for us, the reconciliation of God with humanity. Notice this here in these very mysterious verses here, verses 31 through 32 in Ephesians 5. Here it starts with this. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Here, Paul is quoting from the Genesis text that I referred to earlier here, this idea of the man and woman coming together as representative of cosmic harmony, right? But then he goes on, look what it says here. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. Like, okay, wait, are you talking about marriage? Or are you talking about Christ's relationship with the church, our relationship with God? And the answer is yes, both. What he's saying here is that our marriages are called to be a symbolic representation of the gospel itself. In other words, you show the gospel through the way in which you love your spouse. So my wife and I don't know, is she in here right now? Oh, she is. Okay, well, I got to be careful. No, I'm kidding. So my wife and I, maybe until I just said this, we've been in a good place until just now. Our marriage, we feel like it's been in one of the healthier times in our marriage. And so here's the truth. Like there's, we've been a little more cuddly. We cuddle a little bit more than we maybe did at other times, and hold hands a little bit more. And the kids hate it, right? Completely grosses them out. But here's what I want to tell you, married couples. Listen to this. Be unapologetic about your HDA. Be unapologetic about your household displays of affection. Yes, PDA, you got to be careful. But household, listen, you want your kids to see that you love each other. Not just because you're modeling for them what marriage looks like, but it's even bigger than that. The hope is that in the love that they see between their parents, they can actually begin to see this is representative of God's love for the church. And when the church is functioning right, our love for God. It points them to the gospel. Right? And this ought to, I think, then be an encouragement to those of you who are single, because what this shows here is that marriage is not an end in and of itself. Being marriage isn't the end all and be all of living. That marriage itself has a purpose that is bigger than itself, and that is that marriage is to demonstrate to the world what the love of God for his church looks like, and vice versa. It's this symbol. And so it's to show the gospel to the world. Now, if you're single, here's the thing. There are other ways in which you can do that. There are plenty of ways in which you can show the gospel to others when you are not married. In fact, one of the great ironies of this text in Ephesians, this text that is celebrating the beauty of marriage and whatnot, is that it was written by a man who was single. The Apostle Paul was not married, and he actually goes on in other places to talk about how he kind of wishes some people were more single because married folks are just so caught up in their family that it's hard for them to be engaged in ministry the same way that single folks are. So there's this big celebration of singleness as well. So the point here is that whether you're married or not, the goal is to live a life in a way that points people to the gospel. Now, if you are married, then the primary way in which you do that is the way in which you love your spouse, and your spouse loves you becomes this microcosm of the relationship God desires with us. Now, so again, the central point here is clear. You and your spouse belong together. Here's the problem. Life will try and pull you apart. That's just the truth. Life will try and pull you apart. In fact, I would suggest that there are natural laws at work that are constantly trying to pull you apart. Anybody know the second law of thermodynamics? Yeah, right? Okay, well, I'm going to tell you. Here's the second law of thermodynamics. Here's what it is. This is one of the central laws of the universe. Here's what it is. The second law states that entropy or disorder in a closed system always increases. Here's what this is getting at. What it's saying here is that in our universe, the natural tendency of things is for them to decay, to break apart, to become chaotic, maybe to start out hot, but then to break apart and become cold. It's interesting in the Genesis account, the story of creation. It's a story which talks about creation, but it also tells it in a way in which many scholars see that it is an ordering story. It's about God bringing order to disorder. And what it implies here is that apart from God constantly being at work, our universe would simply fall apart. And what we see in Colossians, I don't have the verse, but it talks about how Christ holds all things together. God is holding all things together because apart from God's work in the universe, it's going to fall apart. It's going to decay. It's going to get cold. It's going to break apart. And so I would say, listen, in the same way in which the universe's natural tendency is to come apart, guess what? The same thing is true with your marriage. Life will naturally try and pull you two apart. Your marriage might start off with a big bang. Your marriage might start off with a passion and a companionship that's red hot thermonuclear. But over time, it can start to decay. It can start to break apart. It can start to go cold. And before you know it, you're writing an article that says 60 is the new 20 and that marriage is impractical. You see, life will simply try to pull you apart. You will be tempted to pull away from your marriage. And this, I think, then is what emerges when we read this passage through this lens. Let me read it for you again, then we'll draw out a point here. You shall not see your brother's ox or his sheep going astray and ignore them. You shall take them back to your brother. And if he does not live near you, and you do not know who he is, You shall bring it home to your house, and it shall stay with you until your brother seeks it. Then you shall restore it to him, and you shall do the same with the donkey, or with his garment, or with any lost thing of your brother's, which he loses and you find. You may not ignore it. You shall not see your brother's donkey or his ox fallen down by the way and ignore them. You shall help him to lift them up again. All right, so we see this just basic principle about community life. Somebody loses something, you try to bring it back, get that which belongs together back together, right? But I think one point that emerges from this, when we read it in light of this context of marriage, the seventh commandment and whatnot, is simply this. As a donkey is prone to wander from his master, so we are prone to wander from our spouse. To switch the analogy a little bit, I remember going mountain biking with my friend of mine in New Jersey. He'd just gotten a new dog named Bowser. I'll never forget Bowser. We went mountain biking, and he said, I'll take my new dog, get him some exercise. Bowser, he'll love this, right? Well, here's the problem. Bowser could not stay on course. Every time Bowser smelled a rabbit, smelled a squirrel, smelled a deer, he's that way, bam, he's that way, bam, he's that way. If I had a nickel for every time my friend had to yell out, Bowser, I would be a wealthy man. Because everywhere he went, he was prone. He would go in this direction. Friends, the same thing is true in human relationships. We are very much prone to wander. It's very easy, I think, in relationships to start thinking, I wonder what it would be like to be married to that person. I wonder what it would be like to be married to them. To that old friend on Facebook. To that coworker who works next to you in the office. To your neighbor. To somebody you simply run into in the grocery store. Like there's just this tendency to wander. We are prone to wander. So, like a donkey that wanders, we are prone to wander. So now here comes a very clear exhortation. Don't be a wandering donkey. There's another word I could use for that animal, but I'm just going to say donkey. Don't be a wandering donkey. You are prone to wander, but we have to recognize this. Recognize that you and your spouse belong together. But actually, we haven't really even gotten to the central point that emerges from this passage. Because the reality is, I've already said, this is incredibly difficult to do. I think that on our own, trying to remain faithful in a relationship for the duration of our lives can be incredibly difficult. And this is why I would say the central point that emerges from this passage in relation to our marriage is this. Surround yourself with people who will encourage you not to wander. You see, this whole passage is about community looking out for each other. Community, my donkey's gone, ox is lost, whatever, sheep is gone. And so the community comes together and helps to make sure that which belongs together stays together. And you need to put yourself in relationships and in community where you are being encouraged to stay together. We need one another because, as we saw last week, here's just the reality. Our emotions will often blind us to the reality of what's going on in our relationship. We saw this last week. Well, we saw last week that in relationships, there's a tendency for conflict to escalate. That as our offended, our emotions cloud our ability to really see what's going on, and then it causes us to escalate things. And so when in our emotional state, we often cannot really see what is actually going on in our relationship. And so you need other people in the community to come along and to help you. You need people to come along and say to you that you can open up to and share what's going on in your marriage. What are the challenges and struggles that you're facing? You need people that you can share with who can then speak into your life, who can pull back from the emotions of the situation and can give you counsel. And so then, as we saw last week, they can say things like, well, look, I'm not so sure that it's your wife that's crazy. I'm not so sure that it's your husband that's crazy. In fact, maybe they're like, honestly, it looks like you're both a little crazy and you need a little bit of help. You need some therapy. And there is no shame and admitting that you're both crazy and you need help. My wife and I, we have been to marriage counseling before because we'll just be the first ones to say it. Honey, isn't this true? Kevin Hanley and Laura Hanley were both a little bit crazy, and there's nothing wrong with admitting that. There's no shame in that. You need to acknowledge that so that you can get help from the outside that can look into the situation and help you to work it out, help to see reality, and then encourage you not to wander. Listen, as a pastor, over the years, I have seen a lot of wandering donkeys. And I'm just going to tell you, if you're a wandering donkey, you come to me, I am going to encourage you to work it out, to stay together. Only in extremely rare exceptions, extremely rare cases, usually when the safety of somebody is at stake here, right? There are exceptions, but they are incredibly rare. More often than not, you come to me and we talk it through, and I'm going to encourage you to stick together. Why? Because you belong together. Friends, I encourage you, find those people in your life, in this church, in this community, with whom you can open up to, whether it's me or others in a community group or whatever. You need this because it's incredibly difficult to do this on our own. We need people who will encourage us to stay together, and we need people in our lives who will encourage us ultimately, who will point us back to the gospel. In the end, that's what this is about. In the end, what enables a marriage to stay together is pointing them back to the gospel, back to understanding the mercy of God, back to understanding the forgiveness of God, that God continues to love and forgive us no matter what we do, and that in that we are called to show that same mercy to our spouse, to love and to forgive. This is the only way a marriage can last. Otherwise, it's gonna pull apart. You need the love of God, the mercy of God to enter into that marriage and to make the second law of thermodynamics go out the window. Friends, you belong together. The gospel reminds us that we belong together like God and humanity belongs together. And the gospel is what empowers us to be able to stay together. We now come to our time of communion. What is communion all about? Communion is an opportunity to once again ground our lives in the gospel and to reground our marriages in the gospel.